Well, please have a seat. Come closer to the front if you would. Let me just introduce what we're going to try to do here in the next 40, 50, 60 minutes. And we'll introduce ourselves in just a minute, too. So this session is called Living Latin in the Classroom, Pros and Cons. And we've got a pro over here and a con over here. And let me just read the abstract that I submitted, and then we'll introduce ourselves. In recent years, many a Latin classroom in America has witnessed an exciting pedagogical development. This new communicative approach emphasizes the importance of hearing and speaking the language of the Romans, often in contemporary and not just ancient contexts. The traditional approach to Latin language instruction has been oriented toward memorization of grammatical forms and rules and the analysis of classical texts. In this session, two college professors, one of whom is more devoted to living Latin than his more traditional colleague, will discuss more or less amicably the benefits and deficiencies of the two pedagogies, offering specific examples from their own experiences to illustrate their points and offering practical suggestions that may be helpful for other Latin instructors. The remaining time will be devoted to answering questions from all of you. So let me just start out by introducing myself. My name is Carl Springer, and I've been teaching Latin the traditional way, I guess, for over 40 years. And so I'm delighted to be joined here by my colleague who's impressed me tremendously with his speaking abilities at the Cam West meeting in St. Louis 2 years ago. This gentleman stood up and delivered a stirring oratio, completely from memory, adorned with Ciceronian gestures, and I was just blown away. So I'm so glad to have him join me. I'll let him introduce himself, and then I'm going to start in with the case I want to make against my colleague, Tom.
So my name is Tom Keyline. I'm a professor of classics at Washington University in St. Louis. I'm going to actually be speaking later this afternoon on what I think a communicative approach to teaching Latin can realistically achieve. So I'm sure I'm going to be repeating myself at least a little bit. So if you come to the second session, sorry. Or maybe I'm saving your time. Maybe you don't have to come to the second session for this one. And I have been teaching using a communicative approach or a sort of hybrid approach, teaching Latin for about the past 10 years, I guess 11 years now. So I turn it over to my learned colleague to make the case against.
Okay. So I'm gonna focus on my encounter with Latin, my personal encounter with Latin, beginning when I was 14 years old, and I was put into a Latin classroom taught by Bjarni Rolstad, who spent a lot of time talking about cross-country skiing at the Olympic level. He was a coach. But we used Latin for Americans, and guess what we did first year? We memorized the first declension. We memorized the first conjugation. We memorized the second declension. We memorized the second conjugation. Memory, memory, memory. And then there'd be a few little sentences here or there. We never spoke a word of Latin. I guess maybe we said salve magister or something like that. But we just focused on the structures of Latin, the grammar. And it was really only probably in my third or fourth year when we started reading Cicero and Virgil that I really began to discover the joys of reading Latin prose and poetry. But first and foremost, it was the grammatical exposure to this amazing language that really appealed to me. I think that at the same time, I began to love geometry. Because these ways in which they were presented to me gave me the kind of intellectual furniture that I really craved. I wanted to see structures. I wanted to learn how things fit together. And I wasn't terribly interested in chatting with Bjarni Rolstad about cross-country skiing in Latin. So that didn't really even enter my mind. I was excited when finally I was able to I think I came home in college at one point when I was learning Greek, and I said to my roommate, this was after 2 semesters of Crosby and Schaeffer doing nothing but memorizing forms. And we find that we're reading Xenophon's Anabasis. And I said, I think I can read Greek. And it's really fun. At one point, I threw Crosby and Schaeffer out the window. But throughout my whole teaching career, I've done nothing but teach Wheelock. And I've used Athanase, teaching Greek, which is a little more communicative possibly, but I've never strayed from, I guess, what first fascinated me about learning these classical languages, which was this delight in grammar, this delight in discovering the structures of these languages. And so my question for my learned colleague is how best can we teach Latin to college students, most of whom will never take more than a couple of semesters, and most of whom aren't going to be majors, or most of whom are not going to go to graduate school. And so I would find common cause with you if our goal is to read fluently at that high level. And if that's your goal, Tom, I salute you. But for many of these students, is it really the case that learning how to chat in Latin with their magister is maybe as valuable as being able to analyze grammar? So I have a colleague who uses Living Latin. He teaches his own children at home. He tells me amazing stories about what a 7-year-old can do. My goodness. She has never learned about accusative with infinitive in indirect statement, but she uses accusative with infinitive in indirect statement. He doesn't have to tell her that. He doesn't give her the categories. They've been reading Latin together, some speaking, and she just picks it up. But that's because she's doing this in sort of an immersion context. She's at home. It's great to learn German by going to Germany. I didn't do that. I learned German by studying grammar and syntax, and then I went to Germany and lived in Germany, and that's when I became fluent in German. And being able to be very comfortable speaking and listening to German was living in Germany. But you can't go live in Italy and speak Latin with anybody unless you hang out with Reginald Foster or Terry Thunberg at the University of Kentucky. But that's an artificial sort of situation. That's not real life for most people. And so my feeling was when I was learning German, again, the old-fashioned way, well, I think one of my teachers said, you'll always be able to go to Germany and order a Frankfurter if you've learned how to read Goethe. But you'll never be able to read Goethe if you've only learned how to order a Frankfurter. And so much of my disposition here is based on my interaction with my fellow foreign language teachers in French and Spanish, and they're all about immersion. And they do take their students to Spain or Italy, and they do spend a lot of time there, maybe living with the host family. Great. But this is Latin. And I meet my students 2 or 3 times a week, 14, 15 weeks in a semester. Is that immersion experience, Professor Keyline, really the kind of immersion experience that's going to even be effective for communicative approaches? And is it worth the time and effort you spend on communicative approaches if they never actually know what the dative case is? So I talked with my colleague, and we made the same argument to him. And I said, I think it's really important for people to know what the dative case is. It just opens up all sorts of things about all sorts of other languages, not just Latin. It's not just an abstract principle. It's really very helpful to know this. And he said, no, I just want my little girl to know Mihi. That's it. If she knows Mihi, she's good. And that may be true in for ancient Romans, they didn't call me the dative case. They just knew it was me. But we're not ancient Romans. And so that's really my question for you in a very friendly and amicable way. How do you deal with that in your pedagogy? How do students really benefit from this? Do all students benefit from this? I'm interested in your hybrid approach, Tom, because I could see maybe adopting some of your techniques myself, and maybe you would, but maybe you do put import grammar instruction in your classroom too. So, but with that, I think I've said my piece. Tom and I are very good friends, so this isn't going to end in fisticuffs, I hope. But I'm gonna.
Session is young.
I think maybe I'll leave it at that and turn it over to you and see how you rebut me, and then maybe we can have a little conversation and get you all involved too.
Yeah. Well, my learned friend started with his learning Latin experience. So I think I'll start with my learning Latin experience also. First, I have to confess, I come from the Catholic tradition, not the Lutheran tradition. So if I hear any boos and hisses, it's okay. But I went to a Catholic high school where I started learning Latin because we all had to start learning Latin. And we didn't speak Latin either. The only Latin we spoke actually was our Latin teacher liked us to pray the Our Father in Latin to start. And so we dutifully all said, Pater noster qui es in caeli, sanctificetur nomen tuum. And at the end of it, every time he said, sedete et tacete. And if you're not a Latinist, that means sit down and shut up. The thing was, we weren't Latinists then, so for the longest time, I thought that's how you ended a prayer. So, anyways, so much for my exposure to the wonders of communicative Latin. Input has to be comprehensible for it to result in language. Anyway, my high school made us learn an ancient language, Latin, and also a modern language, starting at the same time. And by the time I was a senior in high school, I'd been doing, all right, so we started in 7th grade. So it's an extended high school, 7th grade through 12th grade. By the time I was in 12th grade, a senior, I'd been doing Latin for 6 years. I'd been doing Spanish for 6 years. And in Spanish, we were reading Spanish novels. We were watching Spanish movies. We were just doing Spanish stuff. In Latin, we were laboriously pretending that we knew how to translate, like 8 lines of Virgil for a single class session. And I said to myself, what the heck? I started these languages at the exact same time, right? I've had 6 years of both of these languages, and yet in one, I feel pretty comfortable. I can go to Mexico. That's no problem. I can pick up a Spanish language novel and read it. That's no problem. I can't do that in Latin. And so me, 18-year-old or so, said to myself, what's the difference? And I thought at the time, and I more or less still think now, the big difference was how these languages were taught. In my Spanish class, from the very first day, I didn't hear a single word that wasn't Spanish. In my Latin class, I hardly heard any words that were in Latin, and the ones I heard I didn't understand. Sedate et tacete. So that's sort of where I came from. My learned friend said many things. He talked about delight in grammar, delight in structure. And I think that is true for most students who persevere in learning Latin the way we often teach Latin. But I think it probably also excludes a lot of students who maybe don't necessarily delight in learning grammar. And I think really, to sort of cut to the chase, I'll make a few other remarks before I cut to the chase, because I'm a college professor, so I can't now have digressions. And let me nuance this. My learned friend also talked about if you can order a Frankfurter. Sorry, if you can read Goethe, you can order a Frankfurter. But if you can order a Frankfurter, you can't necessarily read Goethe. But I think I would contend that in order to read Goethe, you have to first learn how to order a Frankfurter, metaphorically speaking. And that if you don't learn in that order, you're not actually reading Goethe or reading Virgil in Latin in any meaningful sense. You are, however, getting meaning out of, say, Virgil, right? I have no doubt that when we have students who read Virgil at a pace of 10 lines a class session, very laboriously, consulting dictionaries, consulting commentaries, ultimately giving up and using the translation and matching words. I have no doubt that they're getting meaning out of the text. And I also have no doubt that then when they go back and reread that Latin text, if they go back and reread it, that they are eventually reading it. But to get meaning out of a text is different from reading, and translating and decoding are not the same thing as reading. And so I think a lot of this is where I'll try to sort of cut to the chase, is you got to decide what are our goals for our students. Do we want them to be reading? Is that an attainable goal? We might want other things. We might want to, for example, teach grammar, teach the structure of language. We might want to teach English derivatives. I think we might not talk about this so much in the college classroom, but certainly plenty of middle school students who are learning Latin are learning it not so they can read Virgil, but so that they can learn about structure of language, so they can learn about English derivatives. So I think we have to match our teaching methodologies to whatever our goals are. You begin with the end in mind, all these sort of standard self-help things that are not wrong. And then you tailor your teaching methods accordingly. So I don't think there's any sort of one-size-fits-all answer here. I think you have to figure out, what do you want your students to be able to do? What are you able to do if you're a teacher? What are your competencies? And what kind of time frame do you have to work with? So for whatever it's worth, in the college classroom, if I'm teaching beginning Latin, I do teach beginning Latin exclusively in Latin, but I also teach the dative case, and it's not hard to teach Latin grammar in Latin. It's actually really, really easy because, in fact, casus dativus, that sounds an awful lot like the dative case, as does the nominativus, the genitivus, even the accusativus, the ablativus, the vocativus, and even the locativus. They all are very similar to what we say in English, because essentially all of Latin grammatical terminology is calqued from Greek. So Roman grammarians looked at Greek grammar and they translated it into Latin. So a word like case, Latin is casus. This comes from a Greek word meaning fall, and it became fall in Latin. And it was like German. You still use this fall term if you're sort of old-fashioned about things. Anyway, so I do teach grammar to my beginning Latin students, but I do it in Latin. And so that's one way in the beginning Latin class that I have what you might call a hybrid approach. And I'd be happy to talk more about the hybrid approach and as it changes in different courses, because in fact, as students get more advanced, I tend to use more and more English. And I guess I'll just say why, and then I'll shut up. I am already sedating. I'm about to die. It seems to me that it's relatively easy for students to talk about Latin in Latin, to talk about specific sentences in Latin, because again, it's not hard to talk about the dativus, and it's not hard to paraphrase a simple sentence in Latin. But as our college students anyway get more advanced, and I realize if you're teaching middle school students or elementary school students, you're going to have different goals, and this is not going to be directly relevant to you. But for me, to take the extreme case, say I'm teaching graduate students, we want these graduate students to be able to talk in sophisticated terms about Roman slavery or literary theory or the history of scholarship. And that's very, very hard for almost anyone to do in Latin. And so the more we're trying to talk about literature as literature, the more I tend to do it in English. And the more I'm talking about Latin as Latin, the more I tend to do it in Latin. So sort of oddly, or it might seem oddly, as I teach more and more advanced students, I'm actually using Latin less and less. But yeah, I think I've said enough, and we can discuss from here. I think.
Tom, how that very inspiring. I almost feel like I should just shut up myself because that's really. I wish I had that ability to speak in Latin as you do. So I'm frankly envious. But in terms of your students, let's say your undergraduates, how good at reading do you find they become? Because I think that's something we have in common. I do think that I do think that I want my students to be able to read Latin comfortably at some point, and I'd be happy to do whatever it takes to get them there. Many of my students won't ever get to that level, but Heiko Obermann once said, I want you all to be able to read Latin like a newspaper. And yeah, that is really important for graduate students, for people who are going to really take Latin seriously. But I wonder, say your typical undergraduate, you'd be starting Latin in a freshman class at college even. Are you really going to be able to get them to a level where they can read Cicero or Virgil as a junior or senior comfortably? Or are they still going to be decoding it? And I was moved by your description of this painful process that we all have experienced, I think, where you're just spending all your time looking up in the vocabulary or going to Gildersleeve or whatever to figure something out, decoding instead of reading it like it's a newspaper. And of course, that's the way we learn how to read English comfortably, isn't it? We don't look anything up. We just read. And they say, oh, I don't know that word. Well, I'll move on. Maybe you learn that word. So that's so natural. It's a natural method. I think that's very attractive. And it works very well if you're immersing yourself in that language. But with college students who aren't meeting with you every day, who don't have maybe a dorm. So sometimes you can have living learning arrangements in a dormitory where you actually get together and live and learn in Spanish. And you watch Spanish movies and you eat Spanish food and everything is Spanish on campus. That's really very effective, I think. But again, it's not going to be possible in Latin, I don't think.
No, I don't think so. I mean, there are very few places in the world where this is possible, but most of us aren't going to live in those places. I think I have a few things to say. First, on reading Latin the way we would read a newspaper, I don't think anyone can do that. And one of the big reasons, and that's something I'm going to talk about in a couple hours, is that we don't actually have Latin newspapers. What we have is Virgil or Horace or Cicero. And think of Virgil as much more like Shakespeare or Milton. Now, if you're a native speaker of English, you can probably read Shakespeare, but if you've ever read Shakespeare, you probably think it's not like reading a newspaper. And so I think we have to just acknowledge the fact that pretty much every ancient Latin text we have is much more along the lines of Shakespeare than along the lines of newspaper. They're all advanced. And so I think, in fact, your ski instructor, your noble ski instructor, Nartare is skiing Latina, if you're keeping score at home. Apparently, I have no idea where this word comes from. This is the word you can use. I don't think that's a realistic goal. I don't think it's a realistic goal for anyone. But then to back up, I guess, or maybe to go forward, your question is, hey, if you've got a college freshman who starts learning Latin, what are they going to be able to do when they're at university? And I agree completely. They're still going to be decoding when they read Virgil. My general hope is that they're decoding less. I guess, and the metaphor that I use in the talk that I'm going to give is there's a gap between us and ancient Latin. And I think we can't actually bridge this gap for a bunch of reasons that I'll talk about later. Now, but by doing things like speaking Latin, we can partially bridge the gap. We can get like a little bit closer. And so, in practical terms, what does this mean? In practical terms, maybe it means, hey, my student who's been through this communicative curriculum might have a working vocabulary of, say, 2,500 words. And the student who's gone through a grammar translation classroom might have a working vocabulary of 1,200 words. And so they're going to be looking up 1,300 additional words in the dictionary. And that adds up. And it's not just that, oh, they have to take the time to look the words up in the dictionary. It actually gets into the general cognitive overload that comes with trying to read a Latin sentence that you only partly understand. It's like, all right, I don't have like tennis balls here, but I can juggle 3 tennis balls, and I can juggle 3 tennis balls all day. Like, I will not drop them. I can just keep going forever. I can kind of juggle 4. It's actually a different juggling technique. If you're a juggler, you do it differently. Even numbered balls, you juggle differently from odd-numbered balls. But I'll drop some occasionally. I mean, more than occasionally. 5, I can't juggle at all. Like, I can't. I will drop them all immediately. If you're reading a Latin sentence and you don't know one word, that might be like juggling 3 balls. You can handle that. You can look that one word up. You can keep the structure of the sentence in your mind. You can hold it all together. If you have to look up several words and you're unsure about a conjugation and use of the subjunctive, I don't know, the cognitive burden is immense, and you're almost, I'll just say almost certainly, going to drop a ball. You're going to drop a mental ball. And Latin is an unforgiving language in a lot of ways, because once you go off down the wrong path, you're not likely to get back onto the right path as you're reading a sentence. And so what I'm hoping for my students is that they're just that much closer, that they have to look up fewer words, that they have more of an intuitive sense for the grammar, that they can, that while they're still decoding, they don't have to decode as much, and they're going to get more meaning out of it more quickly and more easily. But I have to admit, like, it's a really modest hope in a sense. Like, I'm still saying, look, they're going to be decoding. They're not going to be reading, certainly not like I read an English newspaper, but frankly, not even like they could read English Shakespeare. Like, they're not going to be anywhere near that close. And I think there's lots of other reasons for that too. But this is, I guess, I'll say, if you look at the internet, which I don't advise. No, I don't mean that. But if you look at the internet, there are a lot of people out there who know the one true way to learn Latin. And if you just do this, then you will read fluently. But it's not just the internet. There are books with titles like Latin, How to Read It Fluently. And you open up this book and it says, oh, well, there's a method, and all you have to do is follow this method and you will read it fluently. And I think that's just wise. Or at any rate, I've been doing Latin since 7th grade. I'm now 41 years old. And I don't read Latin fluently. I read it a lot better than when I was in 7th grade. But I wouldn't claim that I'm a fluent first-time reader of some, I don't know, Tacitus. I've read all of Tacitus, so it doesn't count. But if there's some new Tacitus, right? And you present me with the new Tacitus, I very much doubt whether I just pick it up and be like, oh, yes, well, I'm so glad to learn all these details about Caligula that I never would have known otherwise, or whatever. I don't remember how I started down this road. Suffice to say, I think my hopes are relatively modest, and I take issue generally with people who, I feel like people who overpromise, because I don't think that's fair to anyone. I think we should try to make realistic promises. But anyway, I've gotten sort of off topic. So back to you.
Almost persuaded me. A living Latin professor. Yeah, well put, Tom. And I think I appreciate your recognition of the distance that separates us from the ancient Romans. Philip Melanchthon once said, talking about his own Latinity, and Erasmus, by the way, criticized Melanchthon's Latinity. he said, boy, he's been spending too much time with those Wittenberg theologians. His Latin has gone down the tubes. You know, he should have just been reading the pristine, you know, Pomponius Mela or whoever with me, and not wasted any time reading the Vulgate or something like that. But Melanchthon's Latin was terrific, right? And he really knew Latin in a way that I never really was able to use it. One of the funniest things I discovered when I was looking at this wonderful biography of Melanchthon, it's never been translated by Karl Hartfelder, called Praeceptor Germania. He once was, I think, struggling with attracting students to his lecture on, or his class on Cicero's De Officiis, which we just heard about. So he did what many of us do. He put out a blurb advertising the course. Only he wrote it in elegiac distichs. And we have that poem saying, this is why you should read Cicero's De Officiis, take my class in Latin poetry. So, but even Melanchthon said, we'll never really understand what Latin meant or sounded like or really resonated for people like Cicero, because we're not Cicero. We don't live in that time. Cicero, check this out. Cicero said, I really hate the way the phrase esse videtur sounds. It's just a terrible way to end a clause. Doesn't that sound awful? He says, esse videatur. That's so much better. Well, listen, I don't have that kind of ear, and I don't think we ever will. So we are, I think we need to be reasonable. What is it that we want our students to be able to do? Our students' abilities are sometimes, it's very easy to overestimate what they can do, and we're often disappointed as a result. What I wonder, and what worries me, is kind of a more general question, Tom. I'm not picking on you, but sort of a dumbing down of the entire curriculum, a dumbing down of everything, where we simply are always trying to make everything easier. So this idea of, if you just follow my technique, it's going to be really great, and you're going to have no problems. It's so easy. And AI has come along now, and boy, the promise of ease is right there. You don't have to struggle to learn or memorize anything anymore. You're going to have something in your pocket, maybe in your ears, that will solve all those problems down the road. This promise of ease, right? Ease. Learning should be easy, and I think learning should be fun. Ludus is the Latin word for school. I like that. It's a game. It's not real life. It's a game. Playing a game here. But it's a game that's designed to move you forward, to educate you. And I see the pressure for grade inflation, for lowering of standards, making everything easier all the time in my 40-year career in higher education. And that does disturb me. And I wonder whether we underestimate our own students' interest and abilities when we say it should be easy. We'll make it easier for you. This is going to provide you with a way that you don't have to do all that terrible memory work that Carl Springer's making you do. And so I love this Greek idea, pathemathos, that we learn through suffering. Maybe we learn only through suffering. Otherwise, we're not really learning if we're not suffering. And so one thing that bothers me a little bit about any sort of new pedagogical innovation that promises more than it can deliver is this idea that if you do it our way, it's going to be easier. Now, I'm not sure that applies to what you're doing, Tom. I'm not sure that is easier in many ways, but it might seem that way. It might seem, okay, maybe we don't need to learn all those forms. We can just sort of have fun, and it'll just sort of osmose into our brains, and we won't have to go through that kind of difficult process that I went through, that you went through. But part of me would think that there'd be some students who miss the challenge of it all, the difficulty of it. Maybe Latin is to be preferred and selected by those students who want to challenge themselves, who want to really exert themselves. And are we actually selling them short by telling them you don't really have to work that hard to have fun in Latin? It's a way maybe to keep students in our classroom, to retain them. That's the big word at my university right now, is retention. And you sort of ask yourself what's all involved when the administration is focused on retention. That's the goal. If that's the goal, we've got a real problem as pedagogues, because then you're going to do whatever it takes to retain students, whether or not the students are making the kind of progress you'd like to see. So I wonder what you think about that. Have you ever heard that objection or anticipated that objection?
Yeah, I have various thoughts about that. I mean, I always sort of mention fun, like in passing when I talk about this. I think it's a lot of fun to be in a communicative classroom, to do these things, some of which are quite silly, and that's fun. We're building classroom communities. Students are being engaged. Anyway, I always talk about fun briefly and then say, but I'm not really going to talk about fun. And I guess that's what I'm going to do right now too. I'm going to say, yeah, I think that sort of active approach to teaching Latin is a lot more fun than, say, memorizing paradigm tables or whatever. But then I'm not going to go down that road any further, though I'd be happy if we want to discuss that. I think I do actually think that a communicative classroom is probably an easier way to learn Latin or any language, because humans are by design language learning creatures. We do it naturally. I mean, essentially every child who is not kept isolated in a cave learns to be an absolutely perfect speaker of their native language. And so when we teach Latin in a communicative classroom, we get to take advantage of, hijack, whatever you want to call it, all of our natural human tendencies to learn language. When we do, say, a grammar and translation approach, we are saying, no, we're not going to use those natural tendencies. We're just going to work really hard and power our way through it. Which is not to say you can't do that. It's just to say, I do actually think it's easier to learn communicatively. And I think you do pick up some of it by osmosis, because that's how human brains work. So slight digression, but we're going to circle back. This is going to go somewhere. I mentioned earlier, I'm 41. When I was 39, I took up distance running, and I've become progressively more and more serious about it. And one of the things that I was shocked to learn about distance running is there's just an absolutely universally or near universally agreed on training principle is about 80% of your runs should be easy. And then 20% should be pretty hard. Proportions might vary a little bit, but by and large, we're talking 80% easy, 20% hard. This seems to be just magic. And learning a language isn't like running. I get that. But the same kind of principle, I think, applies. I mean, it's not so important whether it's easy or not. It's important whether the method is effective. And it seems to me that doing a lot of relatively easy stuff, getting a whole lot of reps of easy stuff, it builds up, it accumulates, but you still got to do the 20% hard stuff. So yeah, you're going to learn some vocabulary by osmosis. You're going to learn some grammar by osmosis, but there's still going to be 20% of hard work. And I'm obviously just making these numbers up completely, but I think what I want to argue, and I can argue anything, I'm just making these numbers up, I have no actual evidence, but it feels to me like grammar and translation is saying it's 100% hard. And it will certainly work for the right kind of student with the right amount of time and so on and so forth. But it feels to me like a communicative classroom, it's not 100% hard. It's whatever it is, 50% easy, 80% easy, and then 20% hard that's unavoidable. You still gotta memorize stuff. It doesn't matter what language you're learning. You have to learn words. I mean, you can do anything without learning words. So there's always going to be some kind of memorization involved. You might need to memorize paradigm tables. You might need to memorize all sorts of stuff. But yeah, I think I do believe that it's easier to learn this way. And I think that's probably a virtue, but I'll say to my grammar and translation friends that, if you got lemons, you make lemonade. Like, if your method is harder, you might make a virtue of that necessity and say that does provide mental training. And that gets back again to why you're doing this. And if what your real goal is to provide mental training, mental gymnastics, that might be great, and that might really be what you're doing with your fifth grader in a classical education context. Like, you don't actually really deeply care about reading the Georgics, and maybe you should, but like, you're much more interested in building mental discipline and English word power and structure of the language, and that's great. I mean, I think you just sort of have to know what your goals are. And I guess that's what I'll always keep coming back to. You figure out what your goals are, and then you figure out what works most effectively to reach those goals.
Well, listen, I don't have any rebuttal to that. I love 80-20. That's good. And certainly the idea that education shouldn't be Nicholas Nickleby, right? Squeers and this terrible, crotchety, unpleasant pedagogy. I don't actually believe in that. I'm a pretty popular teacher, actually. And I do want to retain students. I do want them to keep going. I would like them to have fun and learn at the same time in my classroom. So I'm not quite as maybe like Bjarne Rostad as it sounded like, but for the sake of discussion, I've adopted that role, and I'd love to say go. Terry Thunberg has a seminar every summer at University of Kentucky. Maybe some of you have been to that, and again, I'm just filled with admiration for somebody like Terry Thunberg or Tom, who can just converse beautifully in Latin and also then use it in their scholarship. And really, the questions I've had have mostly to do with what am I teaching my second semester Latin student at University of Tennessee, who will never take another course in Latin again, who isn't going to be reading the Georgics or anything else like a newspaper or at all. Is this really benefiting that student? What I'm giving this student at this time, and it could well be, as you said, Tom, that vocabulary and grammatical analysis is going to be far more useful for that student than being able to say some simple sentences in Latin ever would be. But let's listen. We want to really have this be a conversation that includes you all. And so I think at this point, unless Tom, you have nothing else,
should let other people talk.
I'd like to just throw it open. That was our goal here, was to just get ideas from you all and have a conversation with the whole group. So, Joshua.
I'm going to shamelessly plug my session tomorrow on extensive reading and how that might be a middle way between the two of you. So, shameless plug. I think that the main point for me is, what is your goal for your student? What is your learning outcome? One that has benefited me as a pastor is actually to read the newspaper, which is 16th century theological Latin, to read Bible commentaries, Book of Concordia. I can read most of that stuff. It's not a newspaper. It's harder than a newspaper, so I won't use that. But I can read most of that without difficulty. I think that's a valuable for theological students, researchers, and immensely valuable. But I agree with you that probably not reading Juvenal, just first go, totally understand every joke. I mean, it's just so far away. So my question, I suppose, is there something in between ordering the Frankfurter and Goodman that maybe is a valuable goal in itself for your teaching context? Mine's, obviously different.
Yeah, I mean, I'll amplify what you say about early modern Latin. I think that is, so I think that's the middle ground, basically. I think that is, in fact, in theory, so this will never happen, but in theory, I'd love to do an experiment where you take a student who's never learned any Latin and you start them, communicative classroom, whatever. You do full immersion, doesn't matter. And you have them do extensive reading in modern novellas, and then you set them loose, basically going through various early modern colloquia, and you build into other early modern Latin texts where you actually can find level appropriate things in theory for a really long time until you get these students to a genuinely high level. So they never looked at a word of Cicero, Virgil, Juvenal, whatever, but they've read, say, 25 million words of Latin. Could that student then go and pick up and read Cicero easily? I think the answer might be yes. I mean, I think that might be, in theory, a path to doing it. It would be an extremely circuitous path. It's a bizarre path because, one, you could just do grammar and translation, read Cicero. You would have read all the Cicero already, grammar and translation, by the time you did the thing to get to read Cicero straight through. And also, there are some sort of theoretical considerations. You're reading all this non-native speaker Latin, which is, in essence, nothing but chewed up and digested and reproduced ancient Latin. So when you're then going to read the ancient Latin, you've already in some sense read it, because if you look at Erasmus or Luther or Melanchthon or any of these writers, they're just like a tissue of quotations and tags and paraphrases and sewn together by their own words, but so much of it is lifted directly from ancient authors. So when you then go back and read Cicero, you haven't actually not ever read Cicero. You've read lots of redigested Cicero. So I don't know. But in any case, I think what you're saying, Josh, is just totally right. And it absolutely matches my experience. I don't think I could read newly discovered Tacitus with ease, but I feel so much more comfortable reading early modern Latin. And something I'll talk about a little bit in my talk later too. But I think this is an underused resource that we absolutely should be using. It can be a hard sell for classics departments, like the WashU classics department, because of this limited time issue. We have limited time, so there's a real pressure. Let's get straight to Cicero, let's get straight to Virgil. But if you're like me, and it just let's take my personal Latin reading goals. Since I've got until I die, which could be any time, obviously, but I'm taking the long game here. I am totally happy to spend lots of time reading early modern Latin, both in pursuit of long-term goals and also because it's genuinely worth reading in and of itself. So it's just a win-win all around for me. I don't know how you.
Oh, I take this point completely. In fact, I'll put in a plug for my most recent book, the Latin verse of Martin Luther. And there's some wonderful things in there. And again, he's not a native speaker, but boy, he's very comfortable with Latin, and it's really pretty easy to make it through there. So I love this story. Anyway, there's a poem there about cheese. So all sorts of stuff. There's a poem. So evidently there was a contest between Melanchthon, Bugenhagen, and Luther on who could who could compose the shortest prayer before meals. And sometimes those prayers go on long and long, and the turkey is getting hot cold. And so Luther came up with this one, Dominus Jesus sit quibus et aesus. Boy, that you don't have to be a genius to figure that out. Melanchthon won. He just 2 words, Benedictus benedicat. So you can have a lot of fun with 16th century Latin, and it's probably going to be much more accessible for a grade schooler than trying to make it through a long periodic sentence.
Are we allowed to ask questions?
We're asking questions. Go ahead.
Did you ever try for that very prayer for dinner, the sit at that?
That's basically how I summon my children. Yeah.
I actually have two questions. One is, if you started out in a Roman Catholic school, I'm assuming it was pretty much grammar memorization. How did you accomplish a shift? Because I am very old-fashioned, and that's how I learned. You know, my first Latin sentence was something like "Rana in orna est," right? Real practical. But I've always sort of wanted to do this, but I had no idea. So how did you make that? How did you become?
Yeah. So I have an answer to this, but I would advise people today to do something completely different. But just briefly, my answer, I guess, is like all crazy people, I started speaking to myself. And so basically you look around and you say, I don't know, like I see stuff in this room. Can I name this stuff in Latin? Mensa over there and Seminary over there and Pavimentum, and I guess there's a tectum up there somewhere, and there's Parietes, and you like go around and you'll come up like, oh, I can't say that. Well, I can't say that. Let me figure out how to say that. So I did that for a while. I also did Latin prose composition, and then finally, actually, Josh Hayes was one of my very first conversation partners in Latin, and we, you know, sort of muddled our way through some stuff, and he was very patient with me. And
It's more like the other way around.
well, in any case, we muddled through stuff together. And I started making real progress, really coincidentally. And sorry, this is too much autobiography, so I'll try to be brief. I moved. I was in Boston, getting my PhD at Harvard, and I was at a meeting of the APA, American Philological Association, now Society for Classical Studies, and they had a round table for run by Terence Thunberg for spoken Latin. And there's this guy there, Jim Dobrev. And Jim was coming from Sweden, and he'd just taken up a job at UMass Boston. And I said, you speak Latin. I'd really like to speak Latin. And he said, oh, yeah, let's go get dinner sometime. And I thought, oh, there's no way. These are just kind of things some guy says to at a conference. But we get back to Boston. And actually, he hadn't yet taken up his position, but he was about to. Then he moves to Boston. He sends me an email. We go out to dinner. This man was a fluent speaker. He just spoke to me in Latin the whole time. And then he was patient enough to meet with me more or less weekly. And it's the sort of thing, it's just unbelievably helpful. And from there, things sort of accelerated from there. Nowadays, I mean, I think that's what you need. You need to have someone to speak with if you want to speak. But the most important thing is to have someone to listen to. And this is why we're in a much better position now than ever before, because there's YouTube videos, there's podcasts, there's all kinds of stuff where you can get input, and input has to precede output. Like you can't say what you don't know how to say. That's why if you look and you don't know how to say chair, you can't say chair. Like you have to have the input. You have to know the Latin word before you can say the Latin word. So hearing the Latin or reading it or whatever has to precede the output. So I would say now I would be much more saying, hey, do free voluntary extensive reading, look at novellas, listen to podcasts. On the internet, there's all sorts of groups you could join where they'll do virtual speaking sessions. Go to a Politiculum over the summer if you can manage it. I mean, I realize everyone is in different positions as far as family responsibilities, financial responsibilities, and so forth. But that's better than speaking to yourself. But if you've got nothing else, I mean, speak to yourself. So sorry, long-winded answer. That was only one of your two questions.
So my second question was, when you are making the transition into, say, from second year to third year, and or even in those first years, what are your reading next? Is it early modern Latin? Is that what you end up introducing your students to as a reading text?
Yeah, so what I've done with students is a sort of compromise, and almost everything I do is a compromise. So my beginning Latin classes are not a compromise, actually. That's where I just, all Latin, all the time. It's great for the reasons I already sort of discussed. But everything beyond that is at least somewhat of a compromise. So for all of our other undergraduate classes, I don't think the department would really go. I've never actually tried, and I'm becoming more senior, so I could maybe start doing whatever I want there too. But I don't think the department would really go for me, say, teaching Erasmus, because again, the argument would be limited amount of time. Why have these students read Erasmus when they can read Cicero? And I don't even disagree with that. But what I've done is a sort of compromise. So, for example, I taught a Plautus class a couple of years ago, and there's a series of Renaissance colloquia that they go with each of Plautus's plays, and they use the same words as Plautus's plays, but it's all redigested into a Renaissance colloquium, a sort of charming schoolboy scenario with Plautine words. And so I had them as sort of both free voluntary extensive reading, except it wasn't free because I made them do it,
Yeah.
which actually is a big methodological difference. But in any case, as extensive reading, as mandatory extensive reading, I had them read these colloquia that went along with the Plautus plays we were reading. And then that also served as a pre-reading exercise because they're learning the vocabulary that they're then going to be reading in Latin. And in a sense, yeah, okay, it's like the mama bird chewing up the worm and then regurgitating it. And there's a sense in which maybe you might argue we shouldn't do that, but I'm pretty on board with that because the alternative is the students just have to look up all those words in the dictionary. So, yeah.
You had a question.
I did. I also have two questions for each of you, although the second question differs. The first question is the same. What would each of you, and you began to speak to this, Dr. Springer, what would each of you say your goals are for your classes that you teach, given your method? And then a critical question for each of you. I've watched many students suffer through Latin and therefore not like it and not continue with it. So why would we want to do that? And what is the benefit of the small percentage that would continue to want to suffer? On the other hand, in my native language of English, I went through school. I learned probably the 20% of the parts of speech and some diagramming. God bless them in public high school. But still grew up and didn't know my English language very well. So how does what you're doing help them enough with the 20% of hard work when that method didn't work for me in my native language? So
I might start, just to actually maybe disagree with you about your own education, which is a bold move to be like, I'm gonna just mansplain to you education here. But I mean, I might seriously argue that you know English perfectly well.
to speak it.
And to read it and to write it and to listen to it. So if you know English to speak it and read it and write it and listen to it, I would say you know English. So I would actually then sort of, of course, I'm being obnoxious. I know I'm being obnoxious. I'm self-aware enough to realize that. But I would actually say that the sorts of things that maybe you're talking about in terms of diagramming sentences, in terms of grammar, those aren't necessarily English things. Those are language things and maybe should be taught separately, if you want to learn them, in a, say, linguistics type class, which could be an adjunct class, to all this other stuff. And I don't think it would have to be super hard or super time consuming. I could be wrong about that. But anyway, that was a kind of obnoxious response. So forgive me for my obnoxiousness, but Carl, you'll have something less obnoxious to say about goals, I'm sure.
Goals are tricky because in my classes, because we have such a wide spectrum of students to deal
Which
with.
many of us do too.
Yeah, so you do try to help each student meet the kinds of goals that they would want to meet if they even know what goals they want to meet. But we have a separate track for Latin for science students. And so we stress vocabulary and scientific vocabulary and big time in those, because those kids are required to do it because they're getting a biology degree and the biology department requires them to take 2 semesters of a foreign language. So we don't expect they'll ever read Cicero or Luther or anything. But the vocabulary could be really helpful for them. And so then we distinguish those students from students taking it because they maybe would go on and be able to read some simple Latin. Maybe they'd become classics majors, then we'd read some complicated Latin before they're done. But it's one of our challenges is how do we meet the needs of these different students who have different goals. And of course, some of the students don't even want to be there. So what do we do with those students? So that's a great question. And it's part of our constant pedagogical dilemma. How are we going to keep everybody engaged and excited about continuing to learn, motivated? That's as big a challenge as any that we face.
And what are your goals, Dr. Keelan?
Yeah, my goals, I mean, as you'd expect, it varies based on what class I'm teaching. But let me just give you an example I'm teaching an Aeneid class, an advanced undergraduate Aeneid class right now. And in the syllabus, I lay out 3 big goals. One is to increase your ability, the student's ability, to read Latin with ease, pleasure, and understanding. That's my catchphrase, ease, pleasure, and understanding. 2 is to appreciate the Aeneid as a work of literature. And 3, this is an eccentric thing, but we're doing Latin verse composition, and so I have some specific goals related to Latin verse composition. Anyway, bracket that last one off because it's super specific. And so, in general, my goal is often to increase students' ability to read Latin with ease, pleasure, and understanding. And then it just depends, what is the specific class? Where are the students and what are the things that they can do, in my view, most effectively to move them along that path, whether that's reading pre-digested Plowtine comedies in the form of a Renaissance dialogue, or whether that is acting out a scene from Orberg's Lingua Latina textbook, and demonstrating their understanding by saying, lingua est rubra, and they stick out their tongue and they point to their tongue. Oh, it's red, unbelievable. So it just depends on the class. I realize that's a vague response, but we can talk later if you're interested. I can sort of go class by class. You got to write these syllabuses, and in every syllabus you got to have your learning outcomes and so forth. So I got learning outcomes for all of it.
You asked about pain, right?
Yes, I did.
Yeah, so I wouldn't want to push that too far, but I maybe my own example isn't typical, but I know my wife had a student at one point in a class exclaim, "I love grammar," and so there are students who want that challenge, and who don't mind that pain at all. But just the way a long distance runner is going to want to have some no pain, no gain. They're going to want to be pushing themselves as far as they can. So how do we, polish jewels and not necessarily ignore the pebbles in our classes? How do we make sure that those students who are going to go farther are motivated and have plenty to challenge them in your class, even as you have other students who are just barely going to be able to make it? So I don't know how far that pain and gain, the pain goes, pathemathos. I just like it because I'm convinced, I guess, in my heart of hearts, that this is true of life in general, that we only learn anything by having some kind of experience. Now, pathe doesn't necessarily mean painful experiences, but it does mean that we allow ourselves to experience something that's different from what we're used to. So that kind of suffering. But that's how I would, so pain maybe isn't the best translation, but you certainly have to allow yourself to be molded and shaped by your professor, by your classroom environment, your classroom experience. And that's how I would maybe define pathe a little differently than just saying you'll learn through suffering. But
Thank you both. That was
Okay.
great.
Young man in the back, the question.
What is your view on the middle ground being you start by learning grammar, but then you go into conversational Latin, and that's maybe.
It's a good question. And in fact, like for almost everyone of a certain generation, that's what they did. I mean, like that's what I did, right? You start with grammar, and then, in a sense, when you move to using it actively, you're sort of activating knowledge that's already there passively. In general, I would say it's certainly a thing that you can do, and it's easier to activate the knowledge if it's already there passively. But in general, my response is sort of like, say you want to learn Spanish. You could learn Latin first and then learn Spanish. And it would be easier for you to learn Spanish because you'd learn Latin first. But if you want to learn Spanish, I think you should just learn Spanish. So I think the most effective way is to do a sort of hybrid approach, but not a hybrid approach where you just learn grammar, then you layer on stuff afterwards. I think for my money, and I could be totally wrong about this because I have no actual evidence. This is just me making it up. But I feel like the most effective way is to do things like here, I'm going to do this in Latin, but I'm going to teach the grammar in Latin. And so you're getting the grammar at the same time as you're getting the Latin input. And to me, that feels kind of like a force multiplier. Like you're getting more than the sum of its parts. But I could be wrong about that. Again, I have no evidence for that. I'm just totally making that up.
That's a good question, though. Like, first one.
there was somebody back there.
So I've given some thought to this. I think one of the biggest challenges that schools encounter, from the perspective of grade school, and we go from about first grade through 12th grade, is just the kind of like teaching determinants. And getting that, I mean, I teach using Burberry. We're going on to the second. But I haven't really pushed myself through the thing that you push yourself, which is figuring out, say, all of these things. I try and improve my input, what I'm doing with so many things. I just don't, I would love to send one of our students to bar and know them. Right. And then have that student replace me. But I know that I just have certain limits. And then trying to find another teacher, because we really start like third grade. I think it's just challenging. But they do work through the grammar translation method. They work through memory tests, and then they work through real-life, and then they come to me. And I never refer to that stuff until they get stuck. And I said, oh, you already know these things. And they have this, the grammar being there, being present, allows them to correct the misunderstanding. And it doesn't help them acquire language. But it does help them when they get stuck. And I don't know if I would want them to use communicative approach maybe earlier. I'd be curious to see if it would work. But I think, at schools, at the levels that we have them, without developing a cohort of teachers, it's going to be really challenging to start communicative approaches that I'm very pleased with what we're doing, but I know that we can do better.
I mean, everyone can always do it better. I so hear these limitations, and I think actually to just pick up on a couple things that you said, the ability for students who've already been exposed to grammar and translation stuff to correct themselves or to get unstuck. This is a genuine virtue of grammar and translation, or this is a genuine virtue of, let's say, explicit grammatical knowledge, because it promotes like what the second language acquisition research calls noticing. So when, in theory, you can just be exposed to a sufficient amount of comprehensible input and you'll acquire an accurate mental representation of the language. But it takes a long time, it takes a lot of input. A little bit of explicit grammatical instruction goes a long way in promoting noticing so that you don't have to form all that stuff totally from scratch. You got some scaffolding, you see it then in Latin in the wild or in like the semi-wild zoo of Orbert or whatever, and then you can map it onto pre-existing structures. So this is why, like, for me, I think we should teach grammar, whether you teach it in English, whether you teach it in Latin, whatever. And then, yeah, I very much hear you on the basically limitations of teachers. And this is another reason I think that communicative classrooms are almost certainly inherently limited. You can do this at the beginning level. You can even do it at the intermediate level. There's just, I mean, to take the absurd case again, there are just not going to be very many teachers who can have a really high level to like graduate seminar discussion with their students on 20th century literary theory. So at some point, the limitations that like everyone runs into the limitations, whether it's 1, 2, 3, 4, like at some point everyone hits their limitations. And I think this is almost certainly just an intrinsic thing that we cannot overcome. Short maybe of, migrating to the Varium Novum. I mean, there are maybe, like, I don't rule out that there are very few people in the world who can genuinely do this, but I mean, we're talking like really only a very few people in the world.
Older than Josh.
Quick question. The one of the ways I can tell you're a great teacher, it's obvious, both are great. It's obvious. So you must have great entertaining. But one of the things when I was teaching that I relied on to teach was a little bit of humor to kind of make the classroom, and not fall asleep. How do you integrate humor when you do Latin? And can they get it? I mean, can they follow?
Absolutely. So this is so it's bad to be like, oh, I'm such a funny person, because I'm not such a funny person. But everything is funny in Latin because it's ridiculous. Like you can say anything, right? Like and so the key is you deliver it with just absolute gusto. Like I am a true believer in this ridiculous thing that I am telling you about the dative case right now. Or the dative case is not a great example, but
It's pretty funny.
it can be. I mean, yes. It's as far as cases go, it's clearly the funny one.
It's great the students think they're dating.
But yeah, I think actually like because it's obviously just slightly absurd, the whole proposition that we're doing all this in Latin, the students are always ready to laugh. And then, you look them in the eye and then you smile and then you say something in Latin. And like that alone pretty much does the trick.
So if your goal is, one of your goals is to give as much useful input to your students as you can, why not teach grammar in English? Because it's a lot faster to do so. Like you can explain the dative case in 3 minutes and then move on to something else. Or like Rana.
Yeah.
Okay, Anna, ask Anna Ma, I mean, like, or just say frog.
Yeah.
And then you can move on with it.
Yeah.
So I do kind of wonder about that.
Yeah.
So I don't know how useful Caso Dativo that is for reading Cicero.
No, for reading Cicero, so for reading, so like as a theoretical matter, I agree. I agree as a theoretical matter, the dativus is not useful for reading in the strict sense of picking up, saying exegetical theology and Lutheran confession symposia and instantly understanding more or less what that means. Like, but yeah, should we use English when it will save us a lot of time? I think yes. And I am militant about staying in Latin at the very beginning of my beginning Latin classes. As we get through, say, the second semester, and say we're talking about conditional sentences, I'm happy to drop into English briefly. I'm also always happy. So, okay. When you're confronted with a vocabulary word, a Latin vocabulary word, you got to make a sort of split-second decision. Is this worth explaining in Latin, or should I just give an English translation? And I don't know, say your word is pluvia, that means rain, and you can say aqua paide kai locali. And like, it's pretty straightforward, right? Like that means water that falls from the sky. So if you can that quickly just have a super quick paraphrase that uses words your students already understand, I think you should use that super quick paraphrase. On the other hand, sometimes it can be worthwhile to do the contorted explanation because your students are getting input and because it can be funny. So like maybe you're going to draw a funny picture on the board. Maybe you're going to wriggle like a snake and serpens est anima Stanico quod serpit in terra et sibilat, or whatever. Like, if you're going to do that, then your students have just gotten some input. And like, even if you didn't understand that, you probably got that, oh, that's a snake because that guy's doing weird snaky stuff. So that I think is worthwhile. On the other hand, I mean, take some random adverb. Looks. Soon.
Yeah.
Just punt. I mean, I would just punt like almost instantly because you can try to come up with a paraphrase. You can try to say, oh well, this is going to happen soon, but you're risking misunderstanding. And like if you're risking misunderstanding, you're not delivering comprehensive input. So what are you even doing? Like then you're just playing a fun game with yourself. You're not serving students. So yeah.
Listen, we have to close, right? This is our witching hour. So thank you for all